President Biden addressed the nation from the White House today following his party's crushing loss on Tuesday to Donald Trump.
We accept the choice the country made. I've said many times, you can't love your country only when you win. On January 20th, we'll have a peaceful transfer of power here in America.
And he also encouraged Democrats to keep moving forward. To talk about all of that and more, we're joined now by Alex Gangitano, White House correspondent for The Hill. So Alex, what are your biggest takeaways from Biden's speech today?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones you mentioned is that he basically said we will 100% help with this transition. I've already called the former now President-elect Trump, and we're already in touch as teams. I invited him to the White House. And I do think this is something, Trump, we know, did not offer Biden the same when he was elected in 2020, and Democrats since then have called Republicans out for not supporting the peaceful transfer of power, for provoking, January 6th and whatever else. So this is all part of, that theme of we can't complain that Trump didn't do it and not support it as well. So I think we're going to see a lot of him and Vice President Harris really cooperating with this and saying, the country has spoken here.
Yeah, quite the contrast. Another thing he said that I thought was interesting was he spoke about the time he has left in office. There's 74 days left. What else could possibly be on the agenda for him, and what could he actually accomplish before he leaves?
Yeah, so we know that these two wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine are huge for him, but he did want a hostage deal before the election because that would have boded well for the Biden administration. He didn't get that, but I think we will still see him working towards that. I think we're going to see him also push a lot of aid towards Ukraine as much as he can on a unilateral way before the Senate switches to Republican and there's Trump White House. Foreign policy has always been something that President Biden is strong on. It was his focus when he was in the Senate. He came into the White House pushing that as, I'm the foreign policy guy. And so I think he's going to want to close that way too, and have part of his legacy fall on that because, Vice President Harris is a big part of his legacy as well. And the fact that she didn't win, the fact that he didn't, drop out of the race sooner, those are all, negative points for him. So I think he's going to, revert to what the original, Joe Biden as a politician is, which is a lot of foreign policy work.
Yeah, his legacy is forever changed, it feels like. And there's certainly, the blame game is already in full swing right now. We saw Senator Bernie Sanders release a statement, a pretty biting statement, where he said on social media in a statement that the result was no great surprise. Aside from that, I think a lot of people are now saying, in hindsight, the writing was sort of on the wall. So what do you think, in the end, Democrats will say led to this? How are they going to sum it up?
Yeah, I think besides the obvious of maybe Biden should have never announced he was running again, maybe he should have given someone like Harris or another person who could win a Democratic primary more time, those feel like obvious. But what Sanders did here is he opened the door to this conversation over just the future of the Democratic Party. He's been in politics for decades. Mm-hmm. Bernie Sanders has seen a lot of different iterations of this party. And I think his word carries a lot of weight, which is basically he's arguing that Democrats have abandoned the working people. And a lot of people argued that after 2016 as well. Working people are focused on the economy and providing for their family. And when Democrats were talking too much about, things like abortion rights and, Republicans tried to paint Democrats as too extreme during this cycle. An anti-trans ad that came out about Harris was one of the most widely run ads in the nation. Those are all areas that Democrats were kind of caught flat-footed, I think, in not having a good response to, and not being able to flip the script and talk more about the economy, more about immigration, which those are obviously the top issues for voters. I think abortion, Democrats got a big tick and things worked out for them in 2022. Mm-hmm. And then people quickly shifted and were just focused on providing for their family, and it all came down to the economy. And Bernie Sanders is saying here that we didn't see that writing on the wall.
Yeah, it definitely feels like the Democrats thought that would bring them over the finish line again this time, but obviously so much has changed.
That's right.
But looking ahead to the next Trump administration, what do you think is on top of the to-do list? Based off of his campaign, you could assume immigration, the border. But what do you think what is the big priority? And also, do you think there are any Biden orders that they might try and reverse?
Yeah, so we know he has promised mass deportations. He's promised a crackdown on immigration. I think that's one of the first things, just because of how big of a staple it was for his campaign. And then there's some environmental regulations, like drill baby drill was a huge part of his campaign too. But I think basically his promise to ramp up oil production here in the U.S. I also think he's going to want to roll back some of those climate initiatives of the Biden administration, like, the crackdown on emissions from power plants. That's something that I think he'll want to roll back. But a lot of that climate agenda is what I think will be under consideration. And then I think he also will want to lean into foreign policy work and try to, all eyes will be on the U.S. commitment to NATO and how will the Trump administration, change things there, and that could affect how we respond to the war in Ukraine and all that kind of stuff too.
One thing that's also been getting a lot of attention is the role of RFK Jr. in his administration, his alleged role, thinking perhaps with the FDA here. And RFK Jr. said that whole chunks of the department should go. What do you make of that? Do you think that RFK Jr. might actually wield that much power in a second Trump administration? Because he does seem to have a pretty prominent role and really have Trump's ear.
Yeah, it feels super recently when Trump accepted him into the campaign and really took him under as part of his campaign. And I do think it was in an effort to have swing state voters where RFK was still on the ballot understand, don't vote for him because voting for me includes RFK if his message resonates with you. And that worked for him. So now that they've won, I think we'll have to see how much Trump actually continues to embrace RFK or if that was a tactic to win a campaign. But I do think when, you hear Trump say things like, his thoughts on fluoride in water is something that I'm interested in hearing about. I do think he's open to some of these, but curious of how much change RFK can actually implement, or if this is we're willing to listen to his ideas, but not sure how much power we'd give him in a Trump administration.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see, like you said, if he'll use him in the same way he did in the campaign in the White House. But on the Hill, Republicans have a majority in the Senate, right? And the race to replace Mitch McConnell is on. So when you look at who's in the Senate right now, who do you think are the top contenders to replace him and why?
Yeah, so right now it's looking like Senator Thune and Senator Cornyn are the top replacements for him. These, of course, have been Leader McConnell's kind of right-hand men for a long time, so it definitely makes sense. And it seems like Thune has a bit of an edge just because he has a lot of fundraising and campaigning prowess, and people know how valuable he is, and that's a lot of the role of the leader. I think Cornyn also has more of an ear towards the conservative wing of the party, and after this election, we see how valuable that is to the Republican Party. Another person that we know will try to throw his hat into the ring will be Rick Scott from Florida, but I think the general consensus is he's not going to make it very far past a first ballot. But yeah, right now it comes down to kind of the two McConnell understudies, and writing on the wall at this point looks like Thune is just a little bit slightly ahead.
Well, even though Republicans are in control, there are still a couple races that have not been called yet, like Arizona and Pennsylvania. What do we know about those races there? Anything interesting to watch for?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In Arizona, Ruben Gallego is ahead just very slightly, as you see there, above 50%. And that's such an interesting state to me because obviously immigration is a huge issue in Arizona. Trump has won Arizona, and so the fact that split ticket voting was probably pretty popular in that state if he goes ahead and wins the Senate as a Democrat, I find really interesting. And then in Pennsylvania, the Republican McCormick is actually very slightly ahead. He hasn't reached 50% yet. He's actually still under around 49% at this point. Trump has won Pennsylvania, and so will him winning, put the Republican over the edge there, and that would be a big loss for Democrats if they flip that seat.
Yeah, that would be a pretty big upset, especially because Casey has been in Congress for so long.
Very long.
But what other GOP lawmakers do you think we could see rise to the top in this second Trump administration? And also, are there any Republicans that you think might be scared now that Trump is back?
Yeah, I do think some moderates are feeling this and saying, okay, we have 4 more years. We've already experienced this as a moderate. How will we, be the voice of, reason or whatever in a more conservative leaning House or Senate? And I'm sure they're wondering, what kind of things they would oppose, what kind of things they would support. In terms of Trump allies, though, that will definitely rise in the ranks and in status now, I think Jim Jordan is somebody who we're watching as could seek out a leadership role if the House does stay Republican. I also think Elise Stefanik from New York is somebody who, she's had such an interesting trajectory in Congress. She came in actually as a moderate from New York. And years later, during the Trump years, she really became a loyalist. She's a huge ally to him. She was definitely an asset on the campaign, doing media for him. And so will she get some kind of reward, and whether that means inside of the administration or just be, a good ally to him in the House and be able to raise in the ranks there?
Yeah, that will be interesting to watch for. And there are still some House races playing out as well. Republicans do have an 85% chance of winning, though, according to the Decision Desk HQ prediction model. Speaker Mike Johnson formally launched his bid. If he wins, this would be the first time that Trump essentially has a speaker that is fully supportive of all his ideals and goals. So how do you think Trump, assuming Johnson wins, how do you think Trump would use that to his advantage? Anything in particular that he might try and do through Johnson and Congress?
Yeah, I think Trump definitely has an incredible upper hand if he wins the House here. And with Johnson as Speaker, who has showed a lot of allegiance to him, I think something like tax reform, a pro-business tax bill would go through the House very easily. And then anything that, like his immigration goals, like tariffs, like rollbacking some of the Biden climate agenda, anything that could require Congress, Trump gets it because he has Johnson at the helm there. So, if the House has a Speaker Johnson come January, I think it would be pretty smooth sailing. And I do think they would create kind of a very large hole for Democrats to get out of in the next midterms in 2026 for them to want to flip both chambers, which would be a huge uphill battle.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thinking ahead there. Alex Gangitano, thank you so much.
Thank you.
A military judge has overruled Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, deciding that plea deals struck by 3 men connected to the September 11th terrorist attacks are valid. It means the 3 men, including the alleged mastermind behind the attacks, may be spared the death penalty. Washington correspondent Joe Khalil has the details.
Yeah, Bianca, a judge in this case has overruled, apparently, the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, allowing for plea deals to move forward now for the 9/11 mastermind, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and 2 other defendants, Walid bin Attash and Mustafa al-Hassawi. The Air Force colonel, who's the judge in this case, Matthew McCall, made this decision that would effectively spare the death penalty for these 9/11 perpetrators, and instead almost guarantee that they would get life in prison instead. We haven't seen the plea deals, but assuming that would be the case, they would get life behind bars. Now, when news of this pretrial agreement became public, there was an outcry and pushback, mostly from Republican lawmakers, but from others as well. Back in early August, Secretary of Defense Austin then notified the court he was shutting these plea deals down. Now, however, the judge in this case, as we mentioned, saying, sorry, Secretary Austin, you are overruled, saying in court documents, quote, the fact that the Secretary of Defense gave himself exclusive authority to enter into these agreements back in August does not invalidate or somehow render these pretrial agreements that the prosecutor signed as void. Now, we have heard from some of the victims' families of 9/11 attacks, and for some, a guilty plea is what they've been pushing for. They wanted to see it because effectively it would just close the chapter on a very painful moment in their lives. But for many other families, they did not want to see any sort of deal because they were pushing for the death penalty. They wanted to see the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks get the ultimate punishment in their eyes, which would have been that. Now, we haven't heard yet directly from the Pentagon. We are anticipating that at their press briefing, they may say something about this. So that's what we're waiting to see. Nonetheless, a very important decision here and a shocking decision for a lot of those who've been following this case very closely. Bianca.
Joe Khalil, thank you. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Bianca Facchinei. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.